The ring ding still exists. You can buy one today. Same chocolate, same cream, same cake inside, but Drake's Bakeries, the company that invented it. The factory in Queens that made it for 50 years. The workers who showed up every single morning to bake it, that's gone. And the way it went is a story that nobody ever properly told until now. His name was Newman E. Drake, not a household name. Not the kind of man who ends up in history books or on commemorative plaques outside buildings. He was a baker, a practical, serious, deeply skilled baker from Cambridge, Massachusetts, who understood one thing about his trade more clearly than almost anyone else of his era: quality is not an accident. It is a decision, made every single day, at every step of the process. And the moment you stop making that decision, the moment you substitute a cheaper ingredient or cut a corner in the process or decide that close enough is good enough, you have broken something that cannot easily be repaired. Newman Drake was born in 1855. He grew up in the world of New England baking, which in the second half of the 19th century was a world that still remembered what real food tasted like. Bread baked from flour that had been milled from actual grain, butter from actual cream, eggs from actual hens. The ingredients were what they claimed to be, and the products made from them tasted the way food is supposed to taste when nobody has tampered with it. He learned his trade from the ground up, not in a school, not from a book, but from years of standing at ovens and mixing bowls and learning through his hands and his nose and his palate what the difference was between something made right and something made wrong. That education, the kind you cannot get from anywhere except from doing the work, would define everything he built for the rest of his life. By the 1880s, Drake had made his way to New York City, and the New York City he arrived in was one of the most extraordinary environments any ambitious young businessman had ever found himself in. The city was growing at a pace that defied description. Immigration was transforming neighborhoods almost overnight. A tenement block that had been Irish in 1870 might be Italian in 1880 and Jewish in 1890. The population was expanding faster than the city's infrastructure could accommodate it, which meant that every basic need, housing, clothing, transportation, food, represented an enormous and largely unsatisfied market. Drake saw it clearly. The demand for good, consistent, affordable food was essentially limitless, and the supply, particularly of baked goods, was unreliable in ways that drove any honest person to frustration. Corner bakeries varied wildly in quality from day to day and from baker to baker. The ingredients that went into commercial baked goods were not always what they were claimed to be. Consumers had very little recourse and very little information. Into this market, Drake brought the same commitment to consistency that he had developed over a lifetime of baking. Make something good. Make it the same way every single time. Stand behind what you make. In 1888, he formally established Drake Brothers Company in Brooklyn. The name was simple. The mission was simple. The execution was not simple at all. It required an almost obsessive attention to ingredient quality, process standardization, and the training of workers who could replicate results day after day without supervision. But Drake had the temperament for it. He was the kind of man who noticed when something was slightly off and cared enough to find out why. The early Drake's product line centered on layer cakes, substantial, generously portioned cakes that immigrant families recognized immediately as the kind of treat worth spending money on. Drake's pound cake, Drake's coffee cake, products that tasted like something a good home baker would have made, because that was the standard Drake set for himself. The delivery operation was horse-drawn in those early years. The blue and white wagons became a familiar sight on the streets of Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan, reliable, punctual, part of the rhythm of neighborhood life. Shopkeepers who stocked Drake's products knew their customers would ask for them by name, and customers who found Drake's on a shelf would reach for it with the confidence of people who had never been disappointed. That confidence, earned slowly through years of consistent delivery on a simple promise, was the most valuable thing Newman Drake ever built. more valuable than any recipe, more valuable than any factory, and it would take decades of corporate ownership to destroy it. The first decade of the 20th century was a period of extraordinary expansion for American food manufacturing. The railroads that had been built in the previous generation now made national distribution possible. Refrigeration technology was improving rapidly. The machinery that could produce consistent baked goods at scale was becoming available to companies willing to invest in it. Drake's invested, not recklessly, not by borrowing beyond what the business could support, but steadily, methodically, with the same discipline that characterized every other aspect of how Newman Drake ran his company. New equipment when the old equipment limited what was possible. New facilities when the existing space could no longer accommodate the demand. New workers trained to the standards Drake had established from the beginning. By 1910, Drake's was operating at a scale that would have been unimaginable to the man who had started with a Brooklyn bakery and a horse-drawn wagon. The product line had expanded. The distribution territory had grown to cover not just New York City, but the surrounding region, New Jersey, Connecticut, parts of Massachusetts. The blue and white wagons, now increasingly supplemented by gasoline-powered trucks, were moving through neighborhoods that Drake's original deliverymen had never reached. The move to Long Island City, Queens came in stages through the 1920s and 1930s, culminating in the construction of the main production facility that would become the heart of the Drake's operation for the next 50 years. Long Island City was ideal for a manufacturing operation of Drake's scale. It had industrial zoning, rail access, proximity to the waterways that served as highways for commercial goods in that era, and a workforce drawn from the surrounding neighborhoods of Queens who were looking for the kind of steady, skilled manufacturing work that a bakery like Drake's provided. The factory itself was built with the same care that went into the products it made. Not ostentatious, Drake's was not a company that spent money on appearances, but solid, well-designed, built to last and built to work. The production lines were laid out with a logic that anyone who understood baking would recognize immediately. Raw ingredients in, finished product out. Every step of the process visible, manageable, subject to the quality control that Drake insisted upon. The neighborhood that grew up around the factory understood what it was. The factory ran around the clock, not all lines at all times, but the ovens were almost never completely cold. And the smell that drifted out into Long Island City at 2 in the morning, that warm chocolate and sugar smell that meant Drake's was baking, became as much a part of the neighborhood's identity as anything you could point to on a map. Workers who took jobs at the Drake's factory in the 1930s and 1940s sometimes stayed for their entire working lives, not because they had no other options, though the job market for industrial workers in those years had its difficulties, but because Drake's was a good place to work. The pay was fair, the work was skilled enough to take pride in, and the company's commitment to quality meant that what you made every day was something you could be genuinely proud of. That is not a small thing. Most people spend their working lives making things they feel neutral about at best and vaguely embarrassed about at worst. The Drake's workers made products that their neighbors ate and enjoyed and came back for. Products that went into the lunchboxes of children in the surrounding streets. That feedback loop, the knowledge that your work mattered to real people in your community, is a form of compensation that no balance sheet can capture. By the late 1930s, Drake's Bakeries was a New York institution in the fullest sense, not because it had won awards or been celebrated in the press, but because it had earned its place in the daily life of millions of people through the simple and patient accumulation of kept promises, and then came the products that would define the company forever. Here is where the story of Drake's becomes the story of your childhood if you grew up in New York, in New Jersey, in Connecticut or Massachusetts or Rhode Island. If you went to school with a lunchbox in the 1950s or 1960s or even into the 1970s, you know exactly what I am about to describe. You can feel it in your hands right now if you let yourself go back there. The weight of it. The give of the package when you squeezed it. The particular smell when you tore it open. Let's start at the beginning. The Devil Dog. Two oblong chocolate cakes, soft and slightly springy, sandwiching a thick layer of white cream filling. The cream was not the airy, insubstantial cream of lesser products, the kind that disappeared the moment it touched your tongue and left you wondering if it had been there at all. Drake's cream was dense. It was sweet in a way that had genuine substance behind it. It pushed back when you pressed the two cakes together and then yielded, slowly, as you bit through. Every bite was the same. Every single one. That was the miracle of it. You could buy a Devil Dog in 1955 and another one in 1965, and the experience would be identical. Not similar, identical. The same softness to the cake. The same resistance and yield of the cream. The same aftertaste that made you want immediately to have another one. Drake's introduced the Devil Dog in the 1920s. Nobody is entirely sure where the name came from. The company's own records from that period are not always precise on the origins of product names. The most plausible explanation traces it to the First World War. Devil Dog was a nickname that German soldiers gave to American Marines, a term of grudging and somewhat fearful respect for the ferocity of the Marines they encountered in battle. The name carried a toughness, an edge, that suited a chocolate snack cake aimed at American children who wanted to feel like they were eating something serious. Whether Drake's chose the name deliberately or stumbled into it through some now forgotten process, it fit perfectly. The Devil Dog was not a delicate product. It was not for people who were worried about getting chocolate on their fingers. It was substantial. It was satisfying. It was, in the particular vocabulary of American snack cakes, honest. The Yodel came in 1938. Take a piece of moist chocolate sponge cake. Roll it carefully around a generous cylinder of cream filling, sealing the cream inside a spiral of cake. Then coat the entire assembled roll in a layer of dark chocolate that sets firm, but not hard. That is a Yodel. It sounds simple because in concept it is simple. But simple, executed with precision and quality ingredients every single time at industrial scale, is an achievement that most food companies have never managed. The Yodel required a cream filling that was stable enough to maintain its cylinder shape through the rolling process, but soft enough to be genuinely pleasurable to eat. It required a cake that was flexible enough to roll without cracking, but structured enough to hold its shape in the coating process. It required a chocolate coating that adhered properly, set to the right consistency, and tasted like actual chocolate rather than the flavored wax that some manufacturers were passing off as chocolate coating in those years. Drake's got all of it right. Every time. The Yodel occupied a particular place in the Drake's hierarchy that was different from the Devil Dog or what would come later. The Devil Dog was the working class hero, straightforward, unpretentious, exactly what it looked like. The Yodel was something else. More refined, somehow. The spiral construction visible when you bit through it suggested a product that had been designed rather than simply assembled. There was a sophistication to it that sophisticated New Yorkers, people who would have been mildly embarrassed to be seen eating a ding-dong, could consume with something approaching dignity. The ring-ding arrived in 1947, and it changed everything around chocolate cake. Completely enrobed in a thick dark chocolate coating with genuine snap, with a cream filling inside that you encountered only after biting through the shell. It was, in its way, the most technically demanding of the Drake's products. The chocolate coating had to be formulated and applied at exactly the right temperature and viscosity to achieve the snap that made the ring-ding distinctive. Too thick and it overwhelmed the cake. Too thin and it cracked unevenly. The temperature of the cream filling inside affected the setting of the chocolate outside. Every variable had to be controlled simultaneously at production line speeds by workers who understood the process deeply enough to catch problems before they became batches of product that didn't meet the standard. Drake's got it right. Consistently, reliably, day after day, year after year. children across the New York metropolitan area developed elaborate and highly personal rituals around ring-ding consumption. There were those who bit straight through, experiencing the chocolate and cream and cake in simultaneous combination. There were those who peeled the chocolate coating away in sections, eating it separately before addressing the cake beneath. And there were those, a minority but a committed one, who managed to remove the entire chocolate shell in one piece, intact, like a small dark hemisphere, before consuming the components individually in the order that made sense to them personally. These rituals were not trivial. They were the kind of small private customs that children develop around things that matter to them, the daily pleasures that become part of how they understand themselves and their world. A child who ate ring-dings in a specific way was exercising a kind of autonomy, a small sovereignty over their own experience. That childhood doesn't offer many opportunities for. Drake's coffee cakes occupied a completely different emotional territory from the snack cakes. They were not the afternoon treat or the lunchbox reward. They were the morning, the Sunday morning, specifically, when the pace of life slowed enough to sit at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a plate with a slice of coffee cake on it and not hurry. The Drake's coffee cake was not exciting. It was not trying to be exciting. It was trying to be exactly right, consistent, reliable. The taste of a specific kind of domestic comfort that families across the New York region had come to associate with the particular quality of their weekend mornings. It succeeded at being exactly right so consistently and for so long that for hundreds of thousands of families, it became indistinguishable from the morning itself. You didn't eat Drake's coffee cake on Sunday morning. Sunday morning was Drake's coffee cake. By the mid-1950s, Drake's Bakeries dominated the snack cake market in the New York metropolitan area with an authority that the national brands, Hostess, with its Twinkies and Ding Dongs, could not touch in this particular geography. Hostess was everywhere in America, but New York was Drake's. Not because New Yorkers were required to buy Drake's. Because New Yorkers had grown up with Drake's, had formed their tastes around Drake's, and regarded the national alternatives with the particular suspicion that New Yorkers reserve for things that come from somewhere else and claim to be just as good. They were not just as good. Not in New York. Not to people who knew the difference. To truly understand what was lost when Drake's ended, to feel the full weight of it rather than just acknowledge it intellectually, you have to understand what the New York metropolitan area looked like in the years between 1945 and 1975, the years when Drake's was at its peak, the years when the brand was not just successful, but genuinely woven into the fabric of how people lived. The men came home from the war. They married. They moved their families into the new housing developments that were transforming the outer boroughs and the New Jersey suburbs at a pace that made everything feel possible. Levittown on Long Island, the garden apartments of Forest Hills and Flushing and Bay Ridge, the new developments in Bergen County and Essex County across the river. These were working families. Union families, many of them. Families where a father worked a skilled trade or a factory job or drove a truck, and a mother ran the household and packed the school lunches and managed the family economy with a precision and efficiency that went largely unrecognized and entirely uncompensated. The school lunch was a serious production in these families. Not elaborate. There wasn't time or budget for elaborate, but carefully considered. The sandwich had to be something the child would actually eat. The fruit had to travel without bruising. The drink had to stay cold enough. And at the end of the box, the last thing, the reward. The proof that someone loved you enough to put something good in there alongside the practical necessities. That was the Drake's product. Not sometimes. Every day. With the same reliability that characterized everything else Drake's did. For the children of those families. For the generation that grew up in New York and New Jersey between 1945 and 1975, the Drake's product in the lunchbox was not a treat in the usual sense. It was a fixture. It was part of what Tuesday was. part of what the smell of a cafeteria meant, part of the specific texture of childhood in that place and that time. The blue and white Drake's delivery trucks became a feature of the New York streetscape, as fixed and as familiar as anything in the city. Drivers who had worked the same routes for years knew every shopkeeper on their territory by name, knew which stores moved which products fastest, knew when someone was having a rough week and perhaps needed the order to be a little flexible. These were not anonymous commercial transactions. They were relationships, the kind of relationships that make a neighborhood feel like a neighborhood rather than just a collection of strangers who happen to occupy the same geography. The corner stores that stocked Drake's products, the delis, the newsstands, the candy stores, the small groceries that served as the true commercial centers of New York neighborhoods in that era, kept Drake's near the register because their customers reached for it automatically, not because they had thought carefully about their snack cake options and determined that Drake's was superior, because Drake's was what they always bought, and they would have found the idea of buying something else genuinely puzzling. That kind of loyalty, the loyalty that doesn't think of itself as loyalty, that has simply become part of how you live, is the most valuable thing a consumer brand can achieve. It takes decades to build. It requires an unbroken chain of kept promises. And it is, in the end, fragile in ways that don't become apparent until something breaks the chain. Drake's had built that loyalty across two generations by the time the 1960s arrived. Parents who had grown up eating Drake's were now packing Drake's into the lunchboxes of their own children. The brand had jumped a generation and taken root in the next one with the same depth and the same unthinking familiarity. The factory in Long Island City was the physical center of all of this. It ran multiple shifts. The production lines moved continuously through hours when the surrounding streets were quiet. Workers arriving for the 4 a.m. shift in the dead of a January winter walked into a building that was warm, genuinely, enveloping warm, from the heat of the ovens that had been running since the previous evening. The smell of chocolate and sugar and baking cake that greeted them at the door was, for workers who had spent years in that environment, simply the smell of work. The smell of the place they spent their days. A smell their families knew on their clothes when they came home. The community that had organized itself around the Drake's factory in Long Island City was not incidental to the company's success. It was structural to it. Workers whose families had been in the neighborhood for a generation brought a knowledge of the factory and the product that no training program could replicate. They understood the machinery not just mechanically, but intuitively, the way a skilled musician understands an instrument. They knew how it should sound and feel and behave. And they knew when something was wrong before the instruments confirmed it. That knowledge, accumulated over decades and embedded in the workforce and the community, was as much a part of what made Drake's products good as any recipe or any piece of equipment. It was also, as it turned out, entirely invisible to the people who would eventually make decisions about the factory's future. In 1960, Drake's Bakeries was acquired by Borden, Inc. Borden was one of the great American food conglomerates of the post-war era, the company of Elsie the cow, of condensed milk, of a consumer food portfolio that stretched across dozens of categories and represented billions in annual revenue. It was a well-run company by the standards of its time, with genuine expertise in food manufacturing and a track record of managing acquired brands effectively. For Drake's, the acquisition brought resources, capital for expansion, access to Borden's distribution infrastructure, the ability to invest in the Long Island City facility in ways that the family-owned company might have struggled to fund independently. On the surface and in the business press of the time, the deal was presented as a straightforward win for both parties. What it actually represented was something more subtle and, in retrospect, more consequential. Drake's, under its original ownership, had been managed by people who understood what Drake's was in a way that went beyond financial metrics. They understood the relationship between the factory and the surrounding community. They understood why the quality of the ingredients mattered beyond the cost differential. They understood that the workers on the production line were not interchangeable. labor units but skilled craftspeople whose accumulated knowledge was inseparable from the quality of the product. Borden's management understood Drake's as a revenue stream, a profitable regional brand with strong consumer loyalty in an important market. These things were true, and they were not nothing. But they were also not the whole truth. The whole truth included the community, the workforce, the accumulated knowledge, the relationships, all the things that produced the revenue stream and that could not be captured in the acquisition price. The gap between those two understandings, between what Drake's was and what Borden thought it had bought, would take decades to manifest fully. In the early years of Borden ownership, the difference was largely invisible. The factory kept running. The workers kept working. The products kept being made the same way they had always been made. The revenue kept coming in, but the decisions that determined the factory's future were now being made by people in Borden's headquarters who were weighing Drake's against other priorities in a very large portfolio. Capital allocation decisions that directly affected the Long Island City facility were made by people who had never stood on that production floor, never smelled the chocolate at 4 in the morning, never spoken to the workers whose families had built careers around that building. The investment that the aging Long Island City facility needed, not immediately catastrophic, but increasingly apparent as the 1960s moved into the 1970s, competed for resources against Borden's other businesses in the annual capital allocation process. It did not always win that competition, not because anyone decided to destroy Drake's, simply because, in the arithmetic of a large conglomerate, a regional snack cake operation was not always the highest priority. That arithmetic is not malicious. It is simply the logic of how conglomerates operate. And that logic, applied consistently over enough years, produces results that the arithmetic itself cannot account for. The workers felt it before the numbers confirmed it. Equipment that should have been replaced was repaired instead. Maintenance that should have been preventive became reactive. The production lines that had been running with a certain precision and reliability began, gradually, and then more noticeably, to show their age. The workers who understood those lines best, who knew when something was wearing out before it failed, began to have conversations among themselves that they didn't have with management. Because management, increasingly, was not the kind of management that had those conversations. Meanwhile, the national competition was intensifying. Hostess was pushing into the New York metropolitan area with serious marketing investment and the full weight of its national distribution infrastructure behind it. The Ding Dong was competing directly with the Ring Ding. The Ho Ho was competing with the Yodel. In blind taste tests, longtime Drake's consumers often preferred what they knew. But loyalty requires that the product be available, be visible, be supported with the kind of ongoing marketing investment that keeps a brand in the forefront of consumers' minds. That investment was not coming at the level Drake's needed. By the time Borden sold Drake's to Interstate Bakeries Corporation in 1998, the Long Island City factory had already been closed. For 11 years. It had closed in 1987. That closure, the ending of 50 years of continuous production in the building. That was the physical heart of Drake's identity, was the moment the story changed permanently. Not the moment it ended. The moment it became a story about decline rather than a story about a company. The closure was announced with the standard language of corporate necessity, consolidation, efficiency, the need to modernize production into facilities that were better suited to current manufacturing standards. The Long Island City building was old. Its configuration was inefficient by 1980s standards. The cost of upgrading it was significant. All of this was true. None of it captured what was actually happening. What was actually happening was that a factory that had employed hundreds of workers from the surrounding neighborhoods of Queens for 50 years was closing. Workers who had spent 20 and 25 and 30 years in that building were learning about the closure the way workers learn about closures in large corporations, not through conversations, not through any process that acknowledged the weight of what was happening to them, but through a notice posted on a bulletin board, readable by anyone who happened to walk past it on the right day. Think about that for a moment. You have worked in the same factory for 28 years. You know every corner of that building. You have trained the people who work alongside you. You know which machines run warm and which run cool. You know where the chocolate smells different at different times of year because of how the ventilation works in winter versus summer. That factory is, in a very real sense, a part of who you are, and you find out it's closing from a piece of paper on a wall. The workers scattered. Some found positions at other food manufacturing operations in the region. Some were trained for other industries with the help of whatever transition programs existed and whatever union protections their contracts provided. Some, those who were closest to retirement age. Those whose skills were most specific to a production environment that no longer existed, found the adjustment much harder. Their institutional knowledge, the knowledge of Drake's products and Drake's processes and Drake's standards that had been accumulated over decades of daily work, did not transfer with them. It could not. It was embedded in a specific place and a specific practice that no longer existed. When the Long Island City factory closed, that knowledge closed with it. Production moved to a facility in Wayne, New Jersey. The ring dings and devil dogs and Yodels continued to be made. Consumers in the New York metropolitan area could still find them on shelves. The products were, by most accounts, faithful to what they had always been, but they were no longer Drake's in the deepest sense. They were products made with Drake's recipes by workers in New Jersey who had no connection to the history that gave those recipes there. Meaning. Interstate Bakeries, the company that acquired Drake's from Borden in 1998, was, as any observer of the snack cake industry in the late 1990s could have predicted, not the owner that was going to restore Drake's to what it had been. Interstate Bakeries already owned Hostess. It was already carrying debt loads that made serious capital investment in any of its brands difficult. It was already showing the early signs of the financial deterioration that would lead it into bankruptcy in 2004 for Drake's. Being owned by Interstate Bakeries in its final years was less an ownership relationship than a holding pattern. The brand continued to produce. The products continued to sell. Nothing was invested. Nothing was grown. The brand was milked efficiently and without malice for whatever it could produce. In whatever time remained before the larger corporations' problems became terminal, those problems became terminal in 2004. When Interstate Bakeries filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, Drake's, as a brand within the portfolio, was caught in that proceeding. Not because Drake's itself had failed, the brand still had genuine and measurable loyalty in its core markets, but because the company that owned it had. And when a company fails, it takes everything it owns down with it, regardless of the individual merits of each asset. In the bankruptcy restructuring that followed Interstate Bakeries' Chapter 11 filing, Drake's Bakeries was sold to McKee Foods, the Collegedale, Tennessee company that makes Little Debbie snack cakes, the national brand that had spent decades competing against Drake's in the northeastern markets where Drake's was strongest. The oatmeal cream pie people, the Swiss roll people, the company whose products had sat on shelves next to Drake's products for 40 years, reaching for the same consumer, competing for the same shelf space, trying to convince the same New York kid that their version of a chocolate snack cake was worth choosing. Now they owned Drake's. The acquisition was handled quietly. There were no press conferences attended by mayors or governors. No promises made to communities about jobs and futures. No civic celebrations. The brand that had been part of New York's identity for nearly 100 years changed hands as a line item in a bankruptcy reorganization. And most of the people who had grown up eating ring dings never heard about it. McKee has maintained the Drake's product line. The ring ding is still made. The devil dog is still made. The yodel is still made. The recipes have been preserved. The production in Wayne, New Jersey continues. You can walk into a convenience store in Brooklyn today and find a Drake's product on the shelf, and here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. Because the product is good. Genuinely good. The ring ding that McKee produces is, by any reasonable measure, a faithful reproduction of what Drake's always made. The chocolate coating still snaps. The cream filling is still dense and sweet. The cake inside is still soft and slightly springy. Someone who had never eaten a ring ding before would try one today and understand immediately why people loved them. But someone who ate ring dings in Long Island City in 1962, who lived in the neighborhood where the factory was, whose father or uncle or neighbor worked in that building, who grew up with the chocolate smell drifting through the streets at night, that person holds something in their hands today that is both the same product and a fundamentally different experience. The difference is not in the chocolate. The difference is in the context, the relationship, the web of connections between the product and the community that produced it and the community that consumed it. That web was cut when the Long Island City factory closed in 1987. What has existed since then is a product without a community, a name without a place, a taste without the history that gave the taste its meaning. The workers who built Drake's, the men and women who worked those production lines for 20 and 30 years, who trained the people who came after them, who carried in their hands and their instincts a knowledge of how to make these products that no recipe document can fully capture. Those workers are old now. The youngest of them, those who were in their 20s when the factory closed in 1987, are in their 60s today. Many have died. The knowledge they carried has, with very few exceptions, not been passed on to anyone. It was not maliciously destroyed. It was simply never valued. By the people who made the decisions that led to the factory's closure, the workers' accumulated knowledge was not an asset to be preserved. It was a cost to be eliminated. That framing workers as costs rather than carriers of irreplaceable institutional knowledge is the frame through which corporations see the world. It is not the only possible frame, but it is the dominant one. And in that frame, closing the Long Island City factory and moving production to a more efficient facility made complete sense. The arithmetic worked out cleanly. What the arithmetic could not capture was what it cost. There is a particular kind of loss that attaches to regional brands, to the companies that were not national, that were not famous everywhere in the way that Coca-Cola or Hostess were famous everywhere, but that were beloved as specifically, deeply, personally beloved in the places they came from. Drake's was that kind of company. If you grew up in New York and you mentioned Drake's to someone who grew up in Ohio or Texas or California, they look at you blankly. They know Hostess. They know Little Debbie. They may know Tasty Cake if they grew up in Philadelphia. But Drake's, the name means nothing to them. It is a regional artifact, a piece of local culture that never crossed certain invisible lines. But if you grew up in New York and you mentioned Drake's to someone else who grew up in New York, someone your age, from your borough, who packed the same kind of lunchboxes in the same kind of school cafeterias, something happens in their face that you don't see when you mention Hostess or Little Debbie. Recognition. Deep, immediate, embodied recognition. And then, behind the recognition, something softer and more complicated. Something that is not quite sadness and not quite nostalgia and not quite grief, but that carries elements of all three, because the recognition comes with a specific memory attached. And the memory comes with the knowledge that what is being remembered is gone in a way that matters, gone not just commercially, not just as a brand, but as a community, as a relationship, as a piece of what your city used to be. The ring ding you can buy in a New Jersey gas station today is, by every objective measure, the same ring ding. I genuinely believe this. The recipe has been preserved. The process has been maintained. The ingredients meet the same specifications. The chocolate coating snaps when you break it. The cream filling inside is dense and sweet. A quality control inspector from the Long Island City days who somehow found themselves tasting today's ring ding would not be able to say. On the basis of the product alone, that something was wrong. But the ring-ding you remember from your lunchbox in 1963 was made in Long Island City, Queens, by workers who lived in Long Island City, whose fathers had worked in that factory before them, whose children went to school with the children who were eating the product. It was made in a building that the surrounding neighborhood had organized its rhythms around for 50 years, by workers whose names, if you had thought to ask, you might have found in the same parish records and school directories as the families consuming the product. That ring-ding was a community product, made by a community, embedded in a community, consumed by a community that was also the community of its makers. The transaction that put it in your lunchbox was not just a commercial transaction. It was part of a web of relationships and mutual dependencies and shared identities that made a neighborhood feel like a neighborhood. Today's ring-ding is a corporate product, well-made, carefully maintained, respectful of its history, but made in Wayne, New Jersey, by a company headquartered in Tennessee with no connection to Queens, no connection to the workers whose accumulated knowledge made the product what it was, no connection to the community that gave Drake's its identity over nearly a century. The difference between those two ring-dings cannot be tasted. It can only be understood by someone who knows what was lost when the Long Island City factory closed in 1987 and the bulletin board notice went up on the wall. It's not about the chocolate. It was never about the chocolate dot. It's about the factory, the workers, the neighborhood, the delivery trucks moving through Brooklyn streets before dawn, the smell of baking that drifted through Long Island City at 2 in the morning and told the people who lived there that the place they called home was alive and producing and worth something. All of that is gone, and it cannot be restored by preserving a recipe. Find a Drake's product today if you can. They're still out there. Ring-dings and devil dogs and Yodels in convenience stores and supermarkets across the Northeast. The same packaging, more or less. The same products maintained with genuine care by the people who produce them now. Pick one up. Hold it for a moment before you open it. If you are of the age to remember when Drake's meant something specific, when the blue and white delivery truck outside your corner store in Brooklyn was as reliable as the mail, when the devil dog in your lunchbox was the best part of a Tuesday that had nothing else good in it. Hold that memory alongside the product in your hand. What you are holding is a real thing, a good thing. A product that someone worked hard to make faithful to what it always was, but the Drakes you are remembering, the institution, the community, the Queen's factory with the chocolate smell drifting through the winter air at 2 in the morning, the workers whose names you never knew but whose daily work touched your childhood in ways that shaped you more than you realized. That Drake's is gone in a way that cannot be fixed by preserving a recipe. Newman. Drake built something from nothing in Brooklyn in 1888, a baker from Cambridge, Massachusetts, with a conviction about quality and a city full of people who deserved something genuinely good. He built it slowly, patiently, through the daily discipline of keeping a promise he made to every customer who ever bought one of his products. He built it into something that outlasted him, something that fed 3 generations of New Yorkers. Something that became, in the fullest and most meaningful sense, a part of what New York was. What happened to it afterward? The sale to Borden, the years of underinvestment, the closure of Long Island City, the sale to Interstate Bakeries, the bankruptcy. The sale to McKee Foods was not a conspiracy. It was not the result of bad people making evil decisions. It was the ordinary operation of a system that knows how to value what it can measure and has no mechanism for valuing what it cannot. Community is not measurable. Institutional knowledge is not measurable. The relationship between a factory and the neighborhood surrounding it is not measurable. The meaning that a snack cake carries when it is made by your neighbor for your child is not measurable. None of these things appear on a balance sheet. None of them factor into an acquisition price. None of them are protected by any legal framework or contractual obligation. They exist entirely in the realm of trust. And trust, once broken, once the Factory closes and the workers scatter and the trucks stop rolling through the neighborhood cannot be restored by any amount of money or any degree of faithfulness to an original recipe. The ring-ding survived. Drake's did not. And for those of us who grew up in the city that Drake's called home, who reached into a lunchbox on an ordinary Tuesday in an ordinary year and found something extraordinary waiting. That distinction is not a small thing to grieve. It is the whole thing. Newman Drake looked at the largest city in America and decided to make something worthy of it. He was right to try. He was right about what it took. And he was right that the people of New York deserved something made with care by neighbors. For neighbors. We were lucky to have lived in the years when that was true. The chocolate is still there, but it doesn't smell like Long Island City anymore. And it never will again.